Ryan's hand trembled as he signed the power of attorney, but not from guilt, from impatience. 6 weeks after burying my mother, I found the basement lab he'd hidden beneath her floorboards. Rows of unlabeled vials, a stolen centrifuge, and a leather journal filled with dosage calculations in his handwriting. The last entry read, Subject 2, increased to 4 milligrams. Timeline Thanksgiving. Subject 2 was me. I dropped the journal and heard his car pull into the driveway. My knees hit the concrete floor before I could think. The air down there tasted like rubbing alcohol in old pennies, thick enough to coat the back of my throat, and my hands were shaking so badly the journal pages fluttered like something alive. Upstairs, the front door opened. His keys hit the ceramic dish on the hallway table, that small, precise clink he made every single evening. A habit I once found endearing and now understood was the sound of a man who controlled every detail of his environment. I shoved the journal back on the shelf, grabbed my phone, and forced myself up the stairs on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. Claire. His voice drifted from the kitchen, casual, almost melodic. You here, babe? I wiped the dust from my jeans, steadied my breathing, and walked toward the sound of him humming while he uncorked a bottle of wine. But to understand how I ended up in my dead mother's basement, reading my own death sentence in my husband's neat pharmacist handwriting, I need to take you back about 10 months, to a version of my life that looks nothing like this. 10 months earlier, I was a school counselor at Whitfield Falls Elementary, and I was good at it. The kind of good that comes from actually listening, from noticing when a kid's smile doesn't reach their eyes or when a parent signs a permission slip with hands that won't stop moving. I'd built a referral system that caught 3 at-risk situations the district had missed entirely, and the principal, Doug Hewitt, once told me I had a radar for trouble that bordered on supernatural. I mention this not to brag but because it matters, because the woman who could spot a lie in a 9-year-old's posture somehow missed the one living in her own bed for 6 years. Ryan Dawson was, on paper, everything a woman in Whitfield Falls could want. A pharmacist at the CVS on Millbrook, with steady hours and a company car. He coached a recreational softball league on Saturdays. He grilled salmon on cedar planks for the neighbors every 4th of July and always remembered to ask about their kids by name. His handshake was dry. His polo shirts were ironed, and he smelled like sandalwood and something faintly chemical that I'd trained myself to find comforting. My mother, Diane, was the only person who never warmed to him. She'd sit across from us at Sunday brunch, watching him butter his toast with that too careful precision, and her jaw would tighten in a way only I could read. He's very attentive, she said once, which in my mother's vocabulary meant she found him calculating. I told her she was being unfair. I told her that a lot. Mom died on a Tuesday in late October. The leaves on Birch Lane had just turned, and her front yard was carpeted in copper and rust, the kind of scene she would have photographed if she'd still been alive to see it. The doctors at St. Vincent's called it sudden cardiac arrest. No prior history, no warning signs, just a healthy 66-year-old retired cardiologist whose own heart quit without explanation. I sat in the hospital hallway on a plastic chair that squeaked every time I breathed, and the fluorescent light above me buzzed at a frequency that burrowed into the base of my skull. Ryan arrived 40 minutes after I called. His hair was damp like he'd just showered, and he smelled sharply of mouthwash, that medicinal mint he favored that always reminded me of waiting rooms. He held me in the corridor and I buried my face in his chest, but something about his body felt rigid, not like a man absorbing grief but like a man enduring a delay. At the cemetery his phone vibrated 3 times during the service. I watched him check it once, thumbing a quick reply with the device half hidden inside his coat pocket, his face betraying nothing. Work, he said afterward. Urgent restock order. On the drive home he turned the radio to a classic rock station before I could settle into the silence I desperately needed, and his fingers tapped the steering wheel in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the music. I spoke to a realtor, he said, somewhere between a red light and our driveway. Your mom's place, we could list it by next week. Estate taxes, utilities, upkeep on an empty house, that's just money bleeding out, Claire. My stomach folded in on itself. The soil on her grave was still dark and loose. I told him no. He exhaled through his nose, a small controlled sound like a valve releasing pressure, and dropped it. For the moment. By the following weekend Ryan had compiled a folder. Cream-colored, tabbed, labeled in his pharmacy neat print. Sutton Estate, action items. He set it on the kitchen island next to my untouched mug of coffee, slid a pen toward me, and explained patiently logically, the way he explained dosage instructions to elderly customers, that a power of attorney would let him handle the tedious parts so I could grieve in peace. His concern had texture, smooth, practiced, vacuum-sealed, and for the first time since I'd known him, it made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. I pushed the folder aside and said I needed to go through Mom's things first. His left eyelid twitched just once, a microscopic crack in the plaster. Of course, babe. I'll come with you. Help carry boxes. He smiled, and the smile sat on his face the way a magazine sits on a waiting room table, placed there, not grown there. We drove to Birch Lane the next morning. The house smelled like her. Lavender hand cream, old paperbacks, the faint ghost of the rosemary she grew on the kitchen windowsill. Ryan moved through the rooms with a clipboard, tapping walls, checking outlets, murmuring about curb appeal, and staging. I let him orbit while I drifted into her bedroom, where her reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside a dog-eared copy of a mystery novel she'd never finish. In the top drawer of her oak dresser, beneath a stack of silk scarves that still carried her scent, I found a small wooden box with a mother-of-pearl inlay. Inside, a brass key, heavy and old-fashioned, and a handwritten letter on her personal stationery. Her script was steady but urgent. She told me someone had been entering the house when she was away. Medications vanishing from her cabinet. Strange sounds from the basement. She told me to check the basement, to use the key, and to be careful. The letter was dated 5 weeks before she died. I heard Ryan's footsteps on the stairs and shoved everything into my coat pocket, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. He appeared in the doorway, eyes scanning the room, settling on the open dresser drawer. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, and his voice was light but his gaze was not. I held up one of her scarves and managed a sad smile. "Just memories," I said. He nodded, took the wooden box, the larger one, the one I'd already emptied, and said he'd sort through the paperwork so I wouldn't have to. He left the room carrying it like a man removing evidence, and downstairs through the heating vent, I heard him whispering into his phone. "No, she didn't find anything. We need to clear everything out before next week. All of it." The floor beneath my feet felt suddenly thin, like standing on ice that had just groaned. That night, I sat on the edge of our bed while Ryan snored beside me, his breathing wet and slightly whistling through his open mouth, and I turned the brass key over and over in my fingers beneath the covers. The metal had warmed to my skin and I could feel every groove, every tooth, as though my mother had encoded a message in its shape. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his whisper through the heating vent, "All of it," and my ribs tightened like someone was slowly cinching a belt around my chest. The next morning, I called in sick, waited for Ryan's car to disappear around the corner of Maple and 3rd, and drove to Birch Lane with the windows down despite the November cold because I needed air that didn't smell like his sandalwood body wash. Mom's house stood quiet under a pewter sky. I circled the block twice, checking for Ryan's silver Accord or Bryce Connors's black pickup. Bryce, his old fraternity buddy turned realtor, who'd been circling the property like a patient vulture since the funeral. The street was empty. Inside, the basement door waited at the end of the hallway past the kitchen, sealed with 2 locks. The original deadbolt, which accepted the brass key with a stiff click, and a newer padlock, shiny and commercial, that had no business being on my mother's door. I dug through my bag for the slim tension wrench and pick I'd carried since I was 19. Dad had taught me on rainy weekends, a locksmith's daughter's party trick, and worked the padlock until it gave with a grudging snap. The stairs groaned under my weight. A single bare bulb swung from a pull chain at the bottom, casting jittery shadows across what should have been a storage cellar full of holiday decorations and old tax returns. Instead, I found a steel door with a combination keypad. I tried Mom's birthday. Nothing. Tried mine. The lock beeped green. Behind that door, the basement had been gutted and rebuilt. Fluorescent tube lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a flat, clinical white that made my eyes ache. A stainless steel workbench ran the length of the far wall, crowded with a centrifuge, a rack of test tubes, and a digital scale so precise it measured in micrograms. Rows of unlabeled glass vials filled a mini refrigerator that purred softly in the corner. And on a metal shelf above the bench, arranged with Ryan's compulsive neatness, sat 6 leather-bound journals. I opened the first one. His handwriting, I'd know it anywhere, that tight, forward-leaning script, filled page after page with chemical formulas, dosage charts, and notations in clinical shorthand. The compound had a working name, cardiostil, designed to induce arrhythmia indistinguishable from natural heart failure, undetectable in a standard toxicology screen. The early entries were clinical, almost boring, the dry language of pharmaceutical research. But as the journals progressed, the tone shifted. He wrote about test parameters and subject compliance. Subject 1 was identified only by initials. D.S. Diane Sutton. My mother. My hands went cold, then numb, as though the blood had simply decided to stop visiting my fingers. I read how he'd introduced the compound gradually, mixed into her evening vitamins during his weekly visits, the visits I'd praised him for making, the visits I'd told my friends proved what a thoughtful son-in-law he was. The dosage logs were meticulous. He'd tracked her declining energy, her new complaints of dizziness, her irregular heartbeat, all with the detached satisfaction of a researcher watching a hypothesis confirm itself. And then, in the final journal, I found myself. Subject 2. My name wasn't written anywhere, just S2, followed by a projected timeline, dosage escalation notes, and a target date circled in red ink, Thanksgiving. 6 days away. Below the circle, he'd written a single annotation. Life insurance policy matures December 1st. Overlap window 9 days. I lowered the journal. My vision blurred, not from tears but from something deeper, some fundamental recalibration of every memory I had of the last 6 years, every meal he'd cooked for me, every pill he'd handed me for a headache, every glass of wine he'd poured with that careful pharmacist's precision. The room swayed. I braced myself on the workbench and felt the cold steel bite into my palms, and for one terrible moment I understood what my mother must have felt in her final weeks. The creeping weakness, the confusion, the quiet horror of suspecting that the danger was coming from inside her own family. I photographed everything. Every page, every vial, every label, my hands trembling so violently that half the shots came out blurred and I had to retake them, biting the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. I found a security camera mounted in the corner near the ceiling. Ryan had installed it to monitor his lab, not realizing the memory card was still recording. I ejected it and slipped it into my bra, the plastic edge pressing sharp against my sternum. Then I heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. I killed the lights, climbed the stairs in darkness, and peered through the kitchen curtain. Ryan's silver Accord sat in the driveway. He was early. He was never early. He stepped out of the car, phone pressed to his ear, scanning the front of the house with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not the polished concern, not the practiced warmth, but something stripped and reptilian, the face beneath the face. I still had the brass key in my pocket, the memory card against my chest, and my phone full of photographs that could put him in prison. But I was standing in his hunting ground, and he was walking toward the front door. Ryan's hand trembled as he turned his key in the lock, and I stood frozen in the hallway, calculating distances. Back door 8 steps through the kitchen, front door already opening. I chose the kitchen. My sneakers barely whispered on the hardwood as I slipped past the refrigerator, through the mudroom, and out the side entrance into the November air, which hit my sweat-dampened skin like a slap. I cut through Mrs. Hensley's yard, vaulted the low fence that separated her property from the alley behind Birch Lane, and didn't stop moving until I reached Megan's apartment 6 blocks away, breathless, shaking, alive. Megan opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without a word. I told her everything. She listened the way nurses listen, still focused, already triaging. Within an hour, she'd contacted a friend at the hospital lab, and we'd packaged 3 of the vials I'd managed to grab along with hair and saliva samples I'd saved from Mom's hairbrush and toothbrush weeks earlier, operating on an instinct I hadn't fully understood at the time. Megan also drew my blood. She suspected Ryan had already started a low introductory dose on me, and she was right. The lab results, which came back in 48 hours through an expedited forensic channel, confirmed traces of a synthetic compound consistent with the formulas in Ryan's journals. My mother's samples showed the same substance at nearly 8 times the concentration. But here is where I did something that wasn't in any police manual. Something that came purely from 15 years of sitting across from people who lie for a living and learning exactly where their armor is thinnest. I didn't go straight to the police. Not yet. First, I called Bryce Connors. I met him at a diner on Route 14, a greasy little place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous administration. Bryce arrived smelling like too much cologne and not enough conscience, his smile wide and automatic, the smile of a man who'd learned to perform friendliness the way actors learn to cry on cue. He thought I wanted to discuss listing Mom's house. I let him think that for exactly 11 minutes, long enough to order, long enough for him to relax, long enough for the recording app on the phone in my jacket pocket to capture everything clearly. Then I set one of Ryan's journal pages on the table between us, the one that referenced BC, logistics and access, and watched his face drain of color like someone had pulled a plug. I used every technique I'd honed in 15 years of counseling, the long silence, the empathetic nod, the carefully placed, "I understand you were in a difficult position," and Bryce Connors, who had provided Ryan with after-hours access to the house, who had copied Mom's spare key, who had installed the new padlock on the basement door, folded like a cheap card table. He talked for 37 minutes. He gave me dates, details, the name of the offshore account where Ryan planned to park the insurance money. I thanked him, left a 20 on the table, and drove directly to the Whitfield Falls police station with a flash drive containing the lab results, the security camera footage, 143 photographs, and Bryce's recorded confession. Ryan was arrested at our home that evening. He was sitting on the couch watching a football game, a glass of red wine balanced on the armrest. When the officers told him the charges, he didn't flinch. He simply said, "My wife is confused from grief. I'm a pharmacist. I can explain." He could not explain. The journals explained. The blood work explained. Bryce's tearful, snot-streaked testimony explained. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution's expert witness called cardiostil, one of the most deliberately engineered poisons she had encountered in 22 years of forensic toxicology. Ryan received 33 years. Bryce received 9 as an accessory. I sat in the gallery when the verdict was read and felt nothing dramatic. No surge of triumph, no cathartic sob. Just a long, slow exhale like setting down a bag I'd been carrying up a hill I couldn't see the top of. 6 months later, I stood at the window of Mom's house on Birch Lane, watching the first real snow of the season dust the front yard. The house was no longer Mom's house, and it was no longer a crime scene. I'd spent the spring and summer converting it, with help from Megan and a small grant from the county, into a shelter for survivors of domestic violence. 6 beds, a counseling room, a kitchen stocked by local churches, and a garden out back where the rosemary Mom planted still grew thick and fragrant despite everything. I named it the Diane Sutton House. On the dedication day, Mrs. Hensley brought a casserole and told me my mother would have been proud, and for the first time in a very long time I smiled and believed it. The brass key still sits in my desk drawer. I don't need it anymore, but I keep it the way you keep a scar, not because it's beautiful, but because it reminds you that you survived the thing that made it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If it moved you, or reminded you of something in your own life, I'd love to hear about it. Drop your experiences in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe and share. Means more than you know.